Well, thank you very much, Mr. Jeffrey. It's my pleasure to be joining with you today to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart and has been for many, many years. But the chaos and disruption in the environment in the last few years has made me and many others think a lot more seriously about how we do change. I always loved this statement: if the more things change, the more they really don't, then we need to begin doing something differently. And I think that if we look at some recent studies, there has been a lot of criticism around what we call planned change and OD and change management. And many studies have talked about 60 to 70% of change projects failing, and by failing they mostly mean that they did not meet expectations or they did not reach their desired outcomes or results, and they tend not to follow what the plan might have been to begin with, which maybe leaders of the organization have approved. Now, some of this may be explained in part by how we do things, but a lot of it can be explained by the misalignments between the methods we use for change and what's happened in the environment in the last 15, 20, 25 years as various things have changed in the context of the organization. For the past, in the field of organization development, for example, there's a very long legacy of theory, methods, and practices, and they have been used for a long time, and they were introduced way back in the mid 20th century, and they were introduced at a time when organizations ran on the assumptions of being a machine, when organizations were in a rather stable environment, and when organizations were led by managers who in some ways did not always treat workers in the best way and followed sort of a command and control style of leadership. It was during that time that the founding of the field of OD began, and part of it was to bring what we knew from the behavioral sciences about people and motivation and groups and better ways to accomplish work and to accomplish change. And so a lot of what it formed around was using different methods that dealt with the human side of the system differently, and that's kind of the founding. It was always also based on some assumptions, beliefs, and realities about the context and how change occurs. The how change occurs part we learned a lot from psychology and sociology. But the assumptions and beliefs about the realities of the context meant we saw relatively placid environments. Changes did not occur simultaneously and continuously in that era of time. And those changes keep becoming less real, or those assumptions become less real. And they're being replaced by some very, very new assumptions and realities of the environment. Many of the core concepts that got developed early and are still used and still can be used, but need to be delivered and integrated into organizations in different ways. Some of the examples would be Kurt Lewin, who we've often called the father of organization development, basically created action research, and it's got a very simple premise. And the idea of action research is that you join with people in an organization to both collect data, reflect on that data and make sense of it, that is, create meaning from what the data has to say, and then take action, and then immediately follow that up with new data and new ways in which the system has changed or reconfigured. So action research in its earliest form was very much of an action-taking learning cycle. And so that's one that I think we can carry forward, but we can't take the length of time that sometimes action research projects took. He also had the famous change model of unfreeze, change, and refreeze. So the idea would be that 3 different stages would be involved whenever we were trying to change an organization. There would be some kind of an unfreeze period, and what that really means is that we loosen up the norms and we loosen up the mindset of the organization around how things should be done and how right or wrong things are, so that there becomes a little bit more room for change to occur. Then there's redoing things. Maybe it's reorganizing something. Maybe it's changing the way the budgeting system is done. And after the change, there was a segment called Refreeze, which was to help that change to get more embedded in the culture again. So unfreezing is sort of loosening up the culture, changing something, and then refreezing was sort of tightening it back up into a culture. And one of the difficulties with that one, as people like to say today, the organizations are in constant change now, so the time that it used to take to do unfreezing may not be a valuable use of time today, because most organizations don't really need to unfreeze. They are in a constant state of flux now. And often, though, the changes are not, in fact, being organized well, and so a lot of the changes are happening helter-skelter in different ways. And then finally, the idea of refreezing, there's one component of that that's very important, and that is to get something accepted in the culture so that it can sustain for a period of time. And if it's not accepted in the culture, then the change itself will have pretty much not taken in that particular organization. There was also a famous Cotter change model, which many people know. It has 7 steps to it, and again, it's a linear model, so it suggests that you do 1, then 2, then 3. However, recent work on that model shows that very few people are able to do it in a straight linear line, that they are moving back and forth between different steps at different points. And those steps are pretty widely circulated, but it's things like create urgency, form a coalition to lead the change, celebrate small wins as they occur, and so on. Another concept that was built in the early days was the idea of having a future state, a present state, and a transition state. It follows the Lewin model very well, only it talks about it differently. The idea of the future state, and this is Dick Beckhart is the one of the people whose name is attached to this a lot, and he said for an organization to change, it helps if it starts with its desired future, if it creates a view of its future state. Now that future state years ago may have been off in the future a ways, and today the future state might be next year. It may have sped up in terms of what is a future state that is desired. Then we have a present state, which is simply figuring out where the organization is today, and in what ways it has to change in order to reach the desired state. So part of the present state analysis was intended to figure out what parts of it needed to change. And then the transition state would be similar to the change state in the first one that we talked about from Lewin. So the idea that you know where you want to head, you have a good understanding currently of how close or how far away you are from that, and then you go through various changes to help you get there. And that also, I can tell you from consulting work, was a very successful model very often. However, it also is under pressure today, and we'll get to that in a minute as to why we now have to think about leading change in different ways. One of the last ones that has certainly taken root in the field is the idea of how individuals change. And Bill Bridges is one of the people who sort of popularized the idea of the transition model. And in this transition, he talks about the way in which individuals move from one state to another is that they require going through an ending of something, ending of whatever is today, a change or transition, and then a new beginning. And so his work stressed different ways for people to accelerate and deal with their endings and go through their transitions, and then finally to put attention on the idea of creating the new beginning, that is intentionally building people into their new state and helping them to get there. And some of that work obviously has transferred over nowadays to a lot of the extensive tools and methods that are in use with change management specialists all over the world. Another piece of this that was part of the early thinking, and I think still has some relevance, so it's important to note, is the idea of in social systems, just as in physics, there's an idea that critical mass is important for change. So critical mass means the number of people with the right levels of influence who favor a change are the ones who can shift the mindset and norms of a particular social system over. Social systems are also held together and move around norms and around rewards. So the norms and rewards of that social system are changed in part by the critical mass. Then we have the idea at the individual level of attitudes, mindset, and behavior. And I think when we talk about what does it take to change, we still have those same components that are important. Our attitudes, how we think about and perceive the world, and then what behavioral choices we have that we can make. So that is why so many different change strategies sometimes go after attitudes or mindset, and sometimes they just go after behavior. And finally, communication in change and the tools and the supports that are needed for individuals. Like I say, some of that I think now comes out of Bridges, and some of that certainly has come out of John Cotter's work in the past. But the point being that what we learned about change was communication was a critical element in the change, and that has to also be planned and embedded in the change. So most of these ideas and concepts from the past are still relevant in their essence and in their meaning, why we do them. But they'll have to be used differently if we live in a world that is very different from the one where they were first developed. Imagine, any of us working in organizations 30, 40 years ago. We were in a much more placid environment. We didn't seem to understand the system connections of organizations, so we did a lot of work on parts. We would work on the structure, and we would work on the policies, and we would work on training people to try to change behavior. So we would do all various kinds of changes, but we would do them in parts without a good knowledge of how the organization itself is a system. We would do change work as if we could go through those steps in the change process, as if the organization stayed the same as when we first planned it. And I can tell you firsthand that there were times when you could take a planned change process that had X number of steps, and you would work through each of those stages, and it would be happening out over a year or sometimes longer than a year. And so we worked with the assumption that the organization that we started with is staying the same. And oddly enough, in the earlier days, it did fairly well stay the same because the outside environment was not demanding the organization change and was not pushing on everything about the organization. There was little understanding of the relationships among human, technical, environmental, and other systems that actually interact with each other. So we have had to learn to broaden the view we take of an organization in its context. So now the environment and what's changing in the environment is as important and is a driver into what we do in organizations that's called strategic planning. It's like you can't do one without the other. And we assumed that we had plenty of time for lengthy planning, for the ability of resistance to eat up time or detour the change process, or to take uncoordinated actions where we ignore the systems nature of the organization and we just make changes as we see them needed, and we end up with 20 different changes occurring in the organization, but they are not necessarily coordinated or aligned. And so that was part of the past assumptions. However, we all kind of know, I think, that we're in critical changes now in the organization world. So one, we live in a more complex, interdependent global systems. Everybody talks about it. I'm not so sure that all of us in change have done a good job of interpreting that into how we change. We live with faster, more chaotic changes. There are more things happening across environmental sectors at the same time. So our demographics are changing while our technology is changing, while our political systems are changing, while we are trying to be more sustainable and deal with the environment, and two or three more areas. None of the areas are placid anymore. They're all in rapid forms of change. And so that leaves us with greater uncertainty and a lot of ambiguity. In fact, I think the real definition of living in a complex world means there's a lot we don't know, and there's always changes happening. However, we can't fully understand them. And that works against almost all the theory we've built around organizations where certainty and knowledge of the organization have been used as an assumption for how we do things. There's much higher diversity in human systems, partly from the global cross-cultural nature, partly from other demographics that are occurring, and now the new one is probably generational. But with the higher diversity in the human system, the workforce that people were trying to help change 50 years ago is not the workforce we have today, and the workforce today is actually has different ideas about how they should be included and what kind of a say they should have in where things are heading. And finally, the interaction effects among parts of systems are changing the playing field. So in some ways, the interaction around what is happening in the environment and what the organization's strategic plan is saying it wants to do will be changing a lot more rapidly because the playing field itself is changing as a competitor is doing the same thing, or somebody else is rapidly changing something that's important to all organizations, like the way technology has leapfrogged over different iterations of technology. And as people can do that, then your own strategic plan can be out of favor quickly if somebody else has changed the playing field itself. So how we need to change needs to change. Here are some ideas about that. Many foundational concepts, as I mentioned, are still relevant but need to be used differently. rather than longer data collection preceding action. And I can tell you almost every change model I've ever seen has data collection preceding action. Now we have to think about, sometimes we need to take action in order to generate new data from the complex system that we're in, because the system itself is more unknown than it used to be. And by taking some action, we begin to generate new data. And we do this rather rapidly, and not on the large scale, but we do it on a small scale to learn first. This assumes that we don't know exactly what to do or how the complexity is really working. So we need a way to experiment, learn, adapt, and repeat. Experiment, learn, adapt, and repeat. This is now building on work by people like Glenda E. Young, Chris Worley, Ralph Stacey, and Peggy Holman, who have all written about these kinds of processes in complex systems. And it means that we need shorter targeted cycles. So something that looks like this, which is the same model that would have been used in action research, it means we have action learning cycles that are occurring in shorter time durations. And so if we do that, and we're working in a complex system, every action we take produces shifts in the system, and we learn faster about how the system works and how the interrelationships in the complexity are starting to work. And part of our problem today is, if we use old assumptions about organization dynamics and interaction patterns, we could easily be wrong today because of the number of parts that are moving and shifting that are entirely interdependent inside the system. With greater uncertainty, interactions, and rapid shifts, we have to create a way to make meaning in context, meaning we have to learn how this complex system is in fact reacting or acting, and it has to be based in their particular context, because the environment now is not an outside neutral player. The environment now is a heavy influencer of what the organization needs to do. We always needed to be more systemic, and now more than ever we need to be more systemic. That is, across the system, we're taking simultaneous actions to affect the whole system. If we only work on parts of a system today, we are unlikely to change that system at all. We need to be more integrated with outside and inside strategies. That is, what's driving the organization externally, and what internal levers do we have that will provide needed responses quickly. We need some different capabilities inside organizations for agility, speed, and adaptation, meaning we don't have, most of the capabilities we have built into organizations are really built on stability and future growth. And in order to have future growth today, we need to figure out, how are we able to be flexible? How are we able to be agile as the environment shifts? How can we do things quicker than we used to? And how can we adapt when some player in the environment takes a major change and it affects the rest of us? How quickly can we adapt? And that's a set of capabilities that we need in leaders, and we also need that in a lot of specialists inside the organization. Everyone in the organization, all the stakeholders, are very important. We need quicker decisions, we need flexibility in organizing, and we need rapid learning. We can't leave people out of that process. In order for us to understand what's actually going on, the more people that are engaged jointly in that, the more rapid we get data and learning, and that's what we need. This also goes back a little bit to in the 90s, when Peter Senge and others were writing about the learning organization. We haven't seen a lot of that actually take place, and I think the timing now is getting a lot stronger for how we do rapid learning inside the organization, and how people on the front line and people in the leadership offices are both important in that, because they see the world and they see the organization differently. This is a model of organizations as systems, and it's something that I've used for a long time, but there are many of these, about 5 or 6 that I know of. But the important point is just to show an example of what it means to think of the organization as a system when your job is to be a change agent. So if you're interested in changing, it simply shows the parts of the organization that are inside, and then the environment, which is outside, and how all of them need to be thought through at the same time. And then inside the system, it identifies 5 components, 5 key components that are broad in general, but every organization has them, and that they are simply key components that need to be designed and need to be changed almost simultaneously so that we get the results that we're looking for. And so that's just an example of one of those. To continue with how change needs to change, it's important to engage all the stakeholders in committed ways so that all hands learn and take appropriate action. So the learning and the action taking need to occur across the organization system. The power of collective intelligence is important when there are many things happening simultaneously. We have not done that well. We have included people a lot, and we have quite a bit of inclusion and participation in organizations. I don't see it being orchestrated sometimes in the way that would help us to know how the people who deal with the customers and the people who deal with the supply chain see the world and the issues coming at them differently. And that all has to be brought together into the center of the organization. It's important to develop new meanings in fast-changing complex systems. I think our biggest fallacy is we all think we've studied organizations for years and now we understand organizations. And I think I have done the same thing very often. But I think with how things are changing today, we don't fully understand the organization. We don't understand exactly why things happen the way they happen, because the variables that are affecting it are many, and all of them are changing simultaneously. So when that's happening, we're not getting clarity about what this really means. It's important to develop new meanings whenever a complex system is changing fast. Lewin, years ago, when he said, if you want to understand a system, try to change it. Now that feeds beautifully into his action research and the notion I'm sharing today about more rapid learning cycles. So we have to try to change something to learn how it reacts, and we learn more about the system. This raises the importance of how we learn and adapt rapidly, and I think learning and adaptation are becoming critical words for organizations. So a few ways to kind of just summarize some of what I've tried to say here is we have less clarity of organization and its dynamics. As it has become complex and uncertain, many of our books and many of our theories were figured out at a time when organizations were less complex and the environment was less dynamic. We need ways to learn and act more quickly. Any kind of a change process that has long steps in it are working against the fact that the organization will be changing under your feet while some of these long steps are occurring. So we have to find ways to learn and act more quickly. And I think we know some of that now, but I don't think that has been answered yet. We need to use systemic properties of the organization in conducting change. The word interdependence among parts is really critical, and the word simultaneity is a way to begin thinking about changes in organizations so that they are not piecemeal. We need shorter targeted cycles so that we can both understand and change the system. And some of the earlier work that I mentioned earlier, the work of Worley and the work of Glenda Young in particular, talk a lot about shorter targeted cycles so that we can understand first and change at the same time. We need collective engagement, intelligence, and action. So this is not a time to try to run things only from the top or only bottom up. It's a time when the perspectives of the players in the organization are very important. If part of what we're trying to do is learn, part of what we're trying to do is take appropriate action, and then part of what we're trying to do is have everyone adapt. It takes collective engagement to make that happen. We still need people and system transitions. That is, people and the systems both have to transition in changes. So the concepts and the models of that are still very helpful to understand what it is that needs to happen for change to occur. We still need minimum requirements for social system change. Inside organizations, we have a large social system broken down into pockets of social systems. And all of the social psychology work on group dynamics and social processes are critical, and we can't ignore them. There's still minimum requirements that'll happen for a system to change. The critical mass idea, the shift in mindset that can change norms are very important, because if we don't do that, that social system may not change. We do still need the socio-technical optimization idea. One of the strategies for change years ago was to integrate social and technical change simultaneously, and it sort of got lost, I think, somewhere in the 80s or 90s, but it now should come back very strongly again, because today we live in a much more tightly coupled social and technical organization, and technology has grown in importance, almost overtaking the social side. And so again, the idea of how do we optimize the social and technical parts of organizations so the organization functions well. And we need to develop new strategic capabilities internally, and those are the ones for agility, adaptation, and rapid learning. And I think that these kind of capabilities are the kind of capabilities that we build with our talent, we build it with our internal systems, and we build it with our skill development. And so the kind of skills that we need more people to be able to do is to think differently about how we're doing things and watching for the results we're getting, so that we're tightening up that learning cycle more quickly, and being able to be flexible about trying different things and learning a different way to meet that customer's need, or a different way to meet one of the departments that we serve, and how to meet their needs in a different way. So we begin to look for those skill sets and those competencies, and certainly training can fit in here. There's an important value of training in here, but it's not just a training thing. It has to be part of the culture and part of the systems we have that support people in being agile, that support people in adaptation, and support people in rapid learning. And then, of course, the system would need to reward people for changing their behaviors. So we always have rewards stuck in there, because rewards are part of a motivational system. So this work that we need to do is not rocket science. I think it's behavioral science, and therefore much harder, because in many ways there aren't a lot of right answers in behavioral science, and I think that is very much a part of the field of organization change that we need to deal with. So with that, I think I will stop the presentation part of this and welcome questions. Ja-
Yes, Dr. Jamieson, are we done with the webinar content on your side?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So, folks, we are now open for question and answers. If you have any questions, you can either raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your console, or you could insert your questions in the question box. Let me go straight. There are a couple of hands already raised, so let me go one by one. Try to unmute them. We have the first caller. We have Mr. James DeLusa. Mr. James, could you please introduce yourself and ask a question? Mr. James, can you hear us? I believe he's in idle mode. So let me go to the other caller. We have Brother Mahmoud Sharaf. Brother, could you please introduce yourself and ask a question?
Yes, this is Mahmoud Sharaf from Dr. Sama Habib Hospital in Qasim. We have, in the healthcare industry, as you know, it's a dynamic and fast in change. And, the changes are really covering the customers, their needs is always changed. The environment with the technology is also changing rapidly and fast. The manpower serving and the individual serving these needs are also changing. I have here with me, all colleagues from, finance, IT, medical directors, pharmacy, you can name it, and we sometimes feel paralyzed, as as we call us the critical mass, in this organization. That
yes.
sometimes we feel paralyzed where to focus and lead our change. To which direction? You have the customer, the environment, or the staff, the manpower who are helping us. If you could suggest, for us a model or a suggestion where we could,
yes.
Focus our, please.
Yes, I think that's one of the largest questions one could ask, because I think it's a very real situation for you. And I think when we think about being paralyzed, one of the ways in which people get paralyzed is when the options are too many and the uncertainty is too high. So because we know when we make choices and we make decisions, it affects either resources or it affects our people somehow. And so I think what I always like to do is I always like to find my way of thinking about the organization as a system and figure out, what do I know about the interdependency among the parts? Because when I have too many choices of what could be done or what changes could be made, I have to find a way to start somewhere, and in a way it's like prioritizing, but I don't think in the simple way of linear prioritizing. It's, I want to prioritize around actions that I can take that have leverage with other parts of the system. So when I take those actions, I know that I'm affecting other interdependencies related to that. And so to me, the priorities are to find a few levers that are the first and most important ones to deal with. And sometimes it's in a system, sometimes it's in a structure, because structure creates different people interaction patterns, or sometimes it's something cultural. And we look for something cultural, not the kind that takes change, but something that can be tried and people, again, collectively can engage with it. And when they do, then in their workday, they begin to affect changes in other ways. I know that's not really concrete, but the idea is when there's that much complexity and needs for change, there are too many to work on. So you have to pick ones that have the best leverage for your system. And I think that's the way to think about it.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Brother Sharaf, for your question. Let me move to another question. We have, in fact, brother Mr. James has inserted the question. The question is, can you give us an example of this model you described that is working well?
No, I can't, but I can tell you what it would look like. And the reason I can't is because I don't know that anybody's doing it very well yet. The work by the other people, I know a little bit about some of what they've tried, but most of it has been in their writing where they're talking about this. So it's more like leading to the future in terms of how they're thinking about change. One kind of an example, I think, is that if you brought the state, let's say you took part of a system and you bring the stakeholders together. So we don't have to work through different groups. All the groups are represented there. When we have that kind of a large group meeting or larger group meeting, what we can do is we can try things and test things within that group. And what you have is a microcosm of the larger system. So you can try things out in the safety of those kinds of engaging meetings and begin to see how Part A and Part B and Part C interact and respond to different ideas or taking different actions. And as they do, then the learning begins, because that new data is not seen as for or against the idea. It's seen as the natural way that system is reacting. And when I say we have to learn because we don't know exactly what's going on inside the complexity, by doing that in a collective that is at least representative of the system, we can actually begin to see and learn what's likely to happen. Then when we think about the larger organization or a larger scale change, we might be able to identify those critical levers that I talked about in the last answer. We have to learn that, and we don't start out knowing it. And so I can't say that some place is particularly doing this well at the moment. I think there are small experiments going on all over the place, and I think a lot of people are trying things that are similar to this, but that's how I would start, because I would always remember that the organization is a system. In fact, it's large and very complex. I might have to build microcosms of that so that I can test ideas differently and see what kind of responses and effectiveness we get from that. And that would be the learning action cycle that I talk about.
Thank you very much. We have another one. How does the changing environment drive needs for change in how we change?
Yes. Well, I mean, the early part of the presentation was kind of about that, but so here's how I'm thinking about it. When the environment shifts, and well, for one way the environment shifts, by the way, is in all those different sectors: technology, political, social, environmental, and government and regulatory. That's also another one. And so if all of those are changing at the same time or within the same 2-year window, that is what produces the chaos and the ambiguity and the disrupting nature of the change. So the environment has become, I would call, like a large player in all of our decisions, where in the past we used to make a lot of our decisions internally because the environment was more neutral. The environment was not affecting us as greatly in short cycles, because the environment changed over longer periods of time. So as soon as it starts to accelerate in its speed of changing, and even as fast as how many new organizations can be formed in your industry and how quickly they can rise to the top because of a disruptive technology or a completely different way of doing the work. And And so all of that happens in a much more truncated timeline now than it ever used to. And that is what's forcing us to take a new look at, so how do we go about changing this organization? Because one, we can't leave that out. Knowledge of those environmental changes are now critical. And it even affects strategic planning. I mean, strategic planning can't have the long time horizon that it used to have. It has to have shorter cycles, even in planning strategy.
Thank you very much. We have one last question. What are some of the ways change can be accelerated?
The ways change can be accelerated. Well, two things come to mind. The first one is how well we can engage key stakeholders in a system. Now, you may not engage every person at the same time when you have 50 or 60,000 employees, but you can represent that system pretty well with maybe 100 or two, and you can begin to work with 100 or two with some of the methods that we already have. We have ways of working with larger groups, and we can begin to test ideas that way. We can begin to learn the reactions. And to me, accelerating change today means, how do we shorten the timeline from between data collection and action, and how do we shorten the time of learning cycles so that we don't expect every single action as the final action. We see it as a step in a journey where the learning cycles are what will give us the information we need to then make larger scale changes. So I think that's how we can accelerate it.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. David Jamieson. That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss that?
No, I think I've said most of it. I think there's a lot of need for this, and the gentleman from healthcare is a very good example. Healthcare is an industry that is being tossed around by the level of change, and I think, interestingly enough, the same thing is happening in energy, and the same thing happens in technology, and now I think the same thing's starting to happen in retail. So in part, all of the industries are getting affected at slightly different rates, but they're all being bombarded by what's happening in their environment, and trying to do business as usual, most of them, and they can't keep doing that. I mean, they do business as usual, they spend a lot of time and a lot of money and find that they're not getting the results they wish they were getting. So now's the time to think about how we do this differently and begin to put some of our best minds to work on the change practice side. So.
Well, thank you very much. I really want to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MAD, for your time and for this valuable information that you have delivered through this live webinar. So thank you very much, Dr. Jamieson.
And well, thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
The feelings are mutual, Doctor. And thank you very much all those who participated in this webinar and for your questions. We are recording this. Please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org to access the archives as well as to learn more about upcoming webinars. We're going to end this webinar, so you all will be automatically dismissed out. So you all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much.